Good evening and welcome to Fiveable review on the English and French Revolution. My name is Liam Machlin. Can anyone hear me loud and clear? Just give me a thumbs up in the chat room. See if I'm coming live and clear. Bring up my volume a little bit higher. All right, let's see how many people are here. Okay, great. So we're about a month away from the exam. And every day we're like getting more and more information, specifically what's going to be on the exam. And again, you guys probably been practicing SAQs, LAQs, all these different formats. And now we know that the exam is only going to be 45 minutes and we're only going to have one DBQ. Anyone can tell me how they're feeling about the DBQ? Thumbs up, thumbs down. I know my students are not very thrilled about that. So whatever it is, we know for now that we have, I'm sure a lot of people are not really happy with that. For now, we know that we have a DBQ with 5 documents and it's going to be 45 minutes and you can either type it down or write it down and just take a picture of that. So I think they're going to give you like 5 minutes to upload that. So, and we also know that the DBQ is from period 1 to period 7. So that's kind of like big picture going into the exam. So here in Fiveable, we decided to go backwards and start reviewing period 1 to period 7. And today we're probably trying to catch 2 major topics, the French Revolution and the English Revolution. So because we're more reviewing style, we're not going to go into every little details. But if you have any question, so you have the option to drop it down in the bottom. There's an option of ask a question. So just drop your question in as we go throughout the stream. And again, in Fiveable, we have a whole week of streams on different topics this year and next year, wherever you're doing. So usually Thursday is the history part of the Fiveable week. If you take an AP World, US, and Europe, Thursday is your day, 9 p.m. every week until the exam on, or somebody else from the AP Europe team is going to be here giving you a review for the exam. So upcoming streams that we have coming up, specifically I'm going to cover, we're going to have next week, we're going to have a review about more art. So we're going to kind of do a general review about the Renaissance, Mannerism, and Baroque. I find most students are very good with the Renaissance, but very weak with Mannerism and Baroque. So we're trying to help you in case you didn't study those topics very well. We're going to have a Q&A session on the 17th. So every week also we're going to have a Q&A session. So that's another option on Fridays if anyone is interested gathering questions throughout the week. And 2 p.m. also I'm going to do on the 22nd, the rise of fascism, which is period 8, not in the exam, but general knowledge or whatever you're going to study about. On the 30th, not mentioned here, we're going to do a review on the Enlightenment. So many reviews coming up. And remember, think Fiveable, follow Fiveable on Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube, see what's going on. Constant updates constantly going on, specifically with the format of the exam. If your teacher is not on top of it, Fiveable can help you with that. Also study guides. As we get closer to the exam, you probably want to, it's very hard to read an entire textbook, so this might help you up. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today? So we're going to talk about 2 revolutions in the European context, or bigger, broader context. There might be 3 revolutions. You might want to also know the American Revolution. So we're going to talk about the English Revolution, it is in the concept outline, and the French Revolution. We're trying to talk about, when it comes to the exam, they're very interested in causes and effects. So we're trying to causation. Why did the French Revolution happen? Why did the English Revolution happen? And then talking about their effects later on. How did they influence? Also, they might be, who knows, a comparison question between the French and the English Revolution. Which one is more influential? Which one? Many questions can pop from that. So comparing, contrasting, that could be helpful. A few years ago, we had a DBQ about the English Revolution. So it's not that off that they might give you. French Revolution, definitely a possibility for a DBQ. Many, many interesting documents they can use for that. So let's start with the English Revolution. Okay, so we'll do the English chronologically. The English Revolution happened before the French Revolution. Most students and most teachers focus a lot about the French Revolution and not that much about the English Revolution. But we need to know, big picture, that the English Revolution happened before And when we're going to do compare and contrast, we can say that the English Revolution was a lot more stable than the French Revolution. If you study that, that was completely out of control. And as we go through it, if you have any question, feel free just to ask in the bottom of the chat box. All right, so let's get a general overview about the English, what will end up being the English Revolution and all the turmoils. So most of the English Revolution happened, sorry, going back to the slide, under the Stuart family. So after the Tudors, the famous Tudors, Henry VIII, his children, Elizabeth. So Elizabeth was the last Tudor monarch. And after Elizabeth, she didn't have any children, so next in line were the Stuarts. So you don't need to probably know the entire line of the Stuarts, but interestingly enough, the Stuarts were really, really interested in the whole idea of absolutism or absolute power. So the Stuarts, the two main Stuarts who were interested in being absolute monarchs are James I and his son Charles I, that reigned together from 1603 to 1649. So they're kind of the two monarchs that set the stage for a lot of instability in England, even though the Tudors also had more religious instability beforehand. So let's just go over chronological big picture about these two monarchs. The first one is James I. If you take APUSH, you might have actually heard about him. That's the guy from the Jamestown colony. So he starts the Stuart dynasty. He's the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. And he definitely believed in the idea of the divine right. Did anyone study what the divine right theory is? Anyone can tell us in the chat group, what is the divine right theory? Who came up with it? What does it stand for? Anyway. Maybe I'm going to have to teach that too. So kind of like also if you studied Louis XIV, there are many God made you a king. Very good. Okay, so yes. So very good. So if you want to compare and contrast, kind of like Louis XIV and France, the Sun King, there is a whole idea that many European kings are attracted to this whole idea of the divine right, that they believe that basically, yes, that God anointed you and you're doing God's work. So basically, nobody can question your leadership because you're basically your role has been given to you by God. So there are many monarchs that are kind of attracted to this whole idea, and James is one of that. And he even gives a speech in Parliament talking about, like, that he's basically God's lieutenant, and going against them is going against God. And this is also big picture context. This is the era of the Protestant Reformation. Remember, Martin Luther is 1517. So England went through a Reformation period. England is now a Protestant country. James is not interested in making England back into a Catholic, but he is tolerant to the Catholics. So there's a lot of tension between Protestant and Catholics, and he doesn't have he's not anti-Catholic, and that makes him very suspicious by Protestants. And Catholics are not happy with him either, and there's even a plot by Catholic to assassinate him. He's also the famous James that gives us King James's Bible is named after him. So big picture of him also, he is the one that gives us the colony of Jamestown is named after him. He believes in the divine right theory that believes that anyone that goes against him as a monarch is going directly against God. And also, because before he was the King of England, actually he was the King of Scotland. In Scotland, he basically did not need to use Parliament. And now all of a sudden, as the King of England, he finds himself that he needs to get the advice of Parliament. And if he needs to raise money, he needs to ask Parliament. So it's very hard for him that he needs to collaborate with Parliament. And that's a theme that goes out with most Stuart monarchs. They're very unhappy that they need to collaborate with Parliament. As far as they know, absolute monarch, like, I don't need anyone, I can do whatever I want. So that's the challenges that he is facing. Now, even though James, interesting enough, was raised a very strict Protestant, or even kind of more of a puritanical lines. He was raised in Scotland, kind of Presbyterian. When he came to England, he actually really liked the whole hierarchical organization in the church, that you have, like, archbishops and bishops and deacon, the whole structure. He really liked that. And he felt that if you're going to break this structure, it's kind of like an attack on him as the king, or it's kind of like if the format in England will fall, then the whole monarchy will basically collapse. So he was not really thrilled with anyone who's trying to change that. Now, England also, because of the Protestant Reformation, kind of broke up into two segments of society, and nobody was basically happy with the Protestant Reformation. So from the one hand, you have the Catholics who want England to return back to Catholicism. And then on the other hand, you have the Puritans. And Puritans want a very purified church. Anyone knows which Puritans are famous in American history? What are the Puritans famous for? Anybody here taking a push exam? So these Puritans, later on, they're going to be famous for one of the early settlers that started America. I did, but I forgot. Okay, so they're famous for, like, basically Plymouth, Massachusetts, Plymouth Rock. So those are actually from the originators, or Puritans also that established Boston, Massachusetts. So kind of New England, North America was basically founded by Puritans. Now, inside of Puritans, there's another even more radical group. They're called the Separatists. They're the one who technically established Plymouth Plantation in 1620 and give us the whole Thanksgiving holiday and stuff like that. So anyway, basically England is split between two groups. Catholics want to get back to Catholicism. Puritans want more of a purified church. They don't like the whole ceremonies. They don't like pictures and statues, all these sort of things. They want them eliminated. They don't want things that are not mentioned in the Bibles. For example, they don't like Christmas holidays, which is not mentioned in the Bibles. They don't like wedding rings, all these sort of things. So both sides are very unhappy with this situation. But James makes it clear that he doesn't want any kind of like opening up for dialogue about religion. He basically, as he says to Parliament, that he wants one doctrine, one discipline, and one religion. He basically goes off. I don't want every person comes up in one day saying, I would like this way or that way. One way, basically my way or the highway. That's kind of like James' situation. Anyway, James manages to rule and actually die in bed in 1625 with all the problems that he has with all these religious division. He's actually, in retrospect, some historians seem today that he was a pretty smart monarch, and he managed to survive with all of his conflicts in Parliament and actually not be assassinated or removed from power. And that's not the case when we're going to move to his eldest son, Charles I. So that's pretty much all you need to know about James. But all these monarchs are going through phases, and they all have to challenge about their authority or the issue of religion. These are the kind of things that is splitting England that will lead to the revolution. And the third issue is, of course, taxation. So it's religion, power of the king, and the power to tax. All of these things, these three questions, are constantly going with every monarch in England during that time. So after James, we're moving into Charles I very, very quickly. When James dies, he's replaced by his son, Charles I, who was a very weak and an undecisive king. Or one of my college professors basically said that anytime he had an opportunity to choose between the right decision and the wrong decision, he always chose the wrong option. Charles is very interested in creating a very religious uniformity. And when we talk about England in this time, this is this whole vision that he and James are starting to think about. They're starting to think not just about England, but they're starting to think about a united kingdom, what eventually will happen in 1717. But these guys started to envision a collection of all the islands around England to become one united kingdom. So they're thinking about other countries joining them together. Anyone knows what are other countries outside of England that will make United Kingdom, or they're interested in uniting? Well, what's around England? Geography might help you also in the exam to kind of know basic map of Europe. I would definitely recommend before the exam. Okay, so Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Very good. So there's no Northern Ireland yet. It's just Ireland. So they're thinking basically unification of all the territories, taking Scotland, taking Ireland and England, unifying them as one country, but also making his life more complicated, putting them all under one religion, which is kind of complex because Ireland is still Catholic and Scotland is kind of more like Presbyterian / Calvinist. So they're more Calvinist, and England is kind of like Anglican. So uniting all these sort of things is really, really asking for trouble. Now, Charles, also like his father, believes in the divine right and also doesn't really want to talk with Parliament too much. He wants money and he's not interested in hearing them. When Parliament refuses to give him his money, basically, he dismisses Parliament and basically rules England as a dictator for close to 11 years. So that's kind of the root cause of that situation. And eventually, all of his tension with the Parliament would lead to a full-blown war, which will become the Civil War. So the same thing if you studied U.S. history, you studied the American Civil War. In England, there was also a civil war that was kind of split between all those who supported King Charles, were kind of like the Royalists, or the Cavaliers, if you want to know, like if anyone, Cleveland Cavaliers, those who run on the horses. And on the other hands are the Roundheads, those who don't have long hair, or are going to be led by Oliver Cromwell. So basically a civil war erupted between those who supported the king and those who supported the Parliament. And interestingly enough, in the Civil War, the Roundheads, or the non-royalists, won the war, and Charles eventually was put on trial for treason and found guilty and actually executed. So he's the only king in English history to actually be on trial and actually be beheaded. Many of them, there are many monarchs in England that got assassinated, but nothing like in a formal trial and being killed. So Charles makes a lot of wrong decisions, end up starting a civil war, loses the civil war, and actually loses his head. So that's all we need to know about Charles. So he's important to basically the backdrop to the Civil War. Now, once there is no monarch in England, it's a very interesting time, one of the only few times in all of English history that there's no monarch. So what do you do when there's no monarch? It's like a big vacuum. So Parliament is in control. Now, the leader that emerges in the Parliament was the leader of the army that fought against Charles, and his name is Lord Oliver Cromwell. Anyone heard of Oliver Cromwell? So Cromwell belongs to these Puritans who kind of want to make more of a purified church. He becomes the ruler of England, and he passes a variety of laws called the Blue Laws that basically making a very strict society, kind of like cancels 12 days of Christmas. I don't know if you know, but it used to be 12 days of Christmas. That's how you have that famous 12 Day of Christmas song. I'm not going to sing it, but he cancels the 12 Day of Christmas. That's how we end up just having one. Blue Laws also encapsulate things like you're not allowed to have blasphemy, no cursing, no drinking, no adultery, no playing cards. So it's kind of like a very, very strict society to live under. Puritans are very like the non-fun people, if you will. And also he basically goes through a process of basically breaking everything that is Catholic. Anything has to do with Catholicism is being removed. So it's kind of like some sort of a military dictatorship that Cromwell is leading during that time. And when he dies, there's no structure in place. His son, Richard Cromwell, replaces him and becomes a Lord Protector, but it turns out his son is no Oliver Cromwell, and very, very quickly his son loses power, which leads us to the Restoration, to the when they're bringing back Charles the first son, and that's Charles II. So any questions up till now? I know I'm shoving a lot of information. Any questions? All right, let's continue. So Charles II, also known as the Happy Monarch, is basically once Cromwell is the Cromwells are out of power, the question is what we're going to have instead. They decide maybe a restoration, bringing back the king, will be the smart thing to do. So after Charles I, so we basically have Charles II is coming back. He makes some guarantees that he's not going to execute too many people and take revenge. He does actually take revenge, but that's a different story. and he cancels the blue laws. So after all this harsh religious control for more than a decade, Charles is coming back, and he's known as the happy monarch. So back to happy time in England, and basically he's allowing freedom of religion, but the Anglican Church is kind of restored. So back to Anglicanism. And the Anglican Church, if you guys studied Henry VIII, it's kind of like a compromise. They're not Catholics, but they're not like Calvinists. They're not like very radical Protestants. They're kind of in between. Their ceremonies look like they're still the Catholic Church, but in essence, their doctrine is a Protestant doctrine. So it's kind of like 2 sacraments versus 7 sacraments. Did you guys, anyone study here the Anglican Church or the English Reformation? Anyone in the chat room? Because that might also, like, the Reformation is a big picture thing that you might need to know for the exam. There's also a possibility that there will be an essay question about the Reformation. So that's definitely, okay, so great. So that's definitely a good topic to cover. If you're not sure about that, look at Fiveable and on other streams regarding the Reformation or the English Reformation. In 1662, they basically passed Parliament, not really what Charles is interested in, but Parliament is passing the Act of Uniformity that is basically requiring that use of prayer book by the clergy. And if anyone does not follow these sort of rules, they will lose their job. So basically, Parliament is trying to push many laws that will prevent the resurgence of Catholicism in England. And it's also interesting, also in U.S. history, that it's just during this time that the famous William Penn gets a piece of land in America and founds his colony, the colony of Pennsylvania. So it's this Charles II who gives gives the territory to William Penn, who's a Quaker, to start a colony in the New World. So this is also happening around this time. So again, I'm going through because it's a review, but if there's any question, feel free to stop me and ask the question. Also, basically, so for the first few years, Parliament is kind of trying to push Charles to make sure that only that Protestants are in control, that Catholics are being pushed away. And Charles, again, like his father, and like his grandfather, is really not interested in punishing Catholic too hard. He's pro-Catholic. So he's trying to issue what is called the Declaration of Indulgences that basically suspends all the laws against the Catholics. Now, interestingly enough, also his brother, James, future James II, converts to Catholicism. So he's also being nice towards his brother. Now, this creates a lot of tension, and Parliament wants to punish anyone who's Catholic. Charles stands his ground that they are not going to push and punish the Catholics. So it could be that we have the same situation like his father. Is there going to be a civil war? Are they going to push back? So it's a very, very delicate situation. And Parliament pushes back and passes the Test Acts of 1763 that basically denies anyone but an Anglican the right to hold power in Parliament or to hold political office. So basically, Charles is making a stand and Parliament is making a stand by basically pushing each side. So this is a very, very on the verge of a crisis, maybe on the verge of a civil war. And Charles, like his father, dismisses Parliament. And interestingly enough, just before his death, Charles II converts to Catholicism. So that proves all the conspiracy theories that everyone was like, I knew it. I knew this guy deep inside was a Catholic. So now we basically have the Charles II is in conflict with Parliament. They decide it's not worth it for them to start up basically an entire new civil war. So they let it pass, and they basically, Charles II is calling their bluff by the fact that he is allowing his brother to be his successor. So all of this is known as the exclusion crisis. And interestingly enough, Charles II, the Merry Monarch, had like 12 illegitimate children, but he never had a child from his own wife. So when he dies, the next in line is James II. James is a Catholic. So the question is, what will happen? Will there be a civil war because James II is a Catholic? What should Parliament do? And again, the fear is nobody wants to go back to kind of like Puritans back in control and separatists. So Parliament decide to let it go, and they're allowing James II to be a monarch. So if James II was a little bit smarter, who knows, things might have ended up a little bit better for him. But he's also, it seems like a lot of these Stuart monarchs are making a lot of bad decisions. So James II, by the way, known as the Duke of York. So New York State is named after him. So he's the famous Duke of York that comes over and takes the territory that is the Middle Colonies. He has a very short memory and basically acts like his father, Charles I. He's very, very stubborn, and basically openly tells and acts like a Catholic. So it's one thing, the fact that he's a Catholic, but he's going straight at it and actually promotes Catholics to high offices and starts pushing away Protestant. And he suspends the Test Act, and he starts appointing high position people in the military and in Parliament to Catholics. And that really, really builds up the tension. Also in university, professors, many he's appointed, they're Catholic. So he also believes in the divine right theory, and he believes that everyone who's questioning him is basically questioning God. So you see there's kind of like a repetition going on. Also, he's accepting the Pope and the envoy of a Pope to come back to England. So the first time, this is like for the first time since the days of Mary, Bloody Mary, famous Mary, that you have an envoy from the Catholic Church back in England. So all of this is happening together at the same time. So the question is what to do with James with all of these shenanigans. So some people in Parliament decide instead of going to a full-blown civil war against James, they should just wait it out. And James eventually will die. You know, he's not that young. But interestingly enough, bad decision or bad luck for James, he actually gets married in the second wife and has a new child. And everyone knows that with a new child, this kid might become a Catholic. So some people in Parliament decide the best thing for them to do is to try to figure out who can be another monarch with legitimacy who's a Protestant. So they look around and they find that James, his daughter, is actually a Protestant. And they found out also that she is married to another famous Protestant. So he is William of Orange, and she's married the daughter of James. So they're making an offer for Mary and her husband William, basically to come back to England and to conquer England. So this is what is known in English history as the Glorious Revolution. So this is the English Revolution known as the Glorious Revolution. So one more time, the background to the revolution to set it up. James is the monarch. People in England are very, very afraid because he's a Catholic. They look around and they found out that his daughter Mary, who lives in the Netherlands with William of Orange, who's basically not the ruler of the Netherlands, but kind of like he's a stadholder. It's close to being a ruler, but he's not a king. They make him an offer. Why don't you come here and invade England, and we will help you seize the power. So William says yes to this offer, and also he's a very big Protestant leader in the Netherlands. So he lands in England with 15,000 troops in 1688. And James, who was, by the way, James was an experienced general. He fought in many battles. He was very, very good. And he had a bigger army, but we don't know exactly what happened with James. He basically kind of fumbled before the battle and decided just to run away from the battlefield. So this is what is glorious about the Glorious Revolution, that there was no major battle. Basically, William and Mary came over, and James basically fled to France. They actually saw him leaving. They actually let him go. They could have actually catch him, but you know, it's kind of like a complicated situation. So James basically ran away to France, and William and Mary came in and became the new monarchs. But Parliament had some demands before, and they're not just going to give him the crown and have another situation. They demanded to get some sort of assurances that they will not end up being dictators and that Parliament will have more power than the monarchs. So they demanded, and they got what became known as the English Bill of Rights. and they agreed to limit their powers to the supremacy of Parliament. So that's a very important thing that happened, and this is what is known as the Glorious Revolution or the English Revolution. So William III became William III, the King of England, and Queen Mary was his wife. And interestingly enough, he was William III in the Netherlands, and now he came to England. He also turned out to be William III in England, so he didn't have to change numbers or anything. It was the same thing. So now he was the King of England. And one document that you might see if you get documents in the exam, you might get the Bill of Rights, which kind of influence also the American Bill of Rights. And that Bill of Rights kind of define the basic rights that the people of England have and that the king cannot take away. And it's all based upon the negative experiences that they had with all these absolute monarchs lately, Charles and James and so forth. So this Bill of Rights specified things that people have the right to a jury trial, to keep arms, limited the power of the monarchy, that the king needs to call parliament every certain time, and that there should be elections or things like habeas corpus, that you can just grab people and send them into jail without specifically stating what their crime was. So this is also a big influencer on the Bill of Rights in the United States. So if you want to get the chronological event, it's first the English Revolution, then it's the American Revolution, and then it's the French Revolution. So the English Revolution, most students are not that knowledgeable about it. Most people focus on French, but it's the first one. It probably gets a less attention because the revolution itself was not as bloody as the French Revolution, which has a lot more cooler stories about guillotines and all crazy people. But the English Revolution altogether is kind of a smooth transition. Parliament gets more power, the king loses power, but the Bill of Rights or documents like that are being established. So that's pretty much what you might need to know about the English Revolution transition and taking away the power of the monarch. So any questions up till now? Any questions? Nothing about the English Revolution? Everyone is knowledgeable? All right. All right, so let's see. Okay, so let's continue and talking about now about the French Revolution. Oops, 1 second. All right, that did not work. Let me try one more time. Okay, so let's talk about the French Revolution. All right, that's something a lot of people are a little bit more aware. Sorry, let's see if I can get a little bit larger. Okay, anyone know this cartoon, what this cartoon is talking about? Everyone, I assume, studied the French Revolution, right? Well, let's say it a different way. Anyone knows what the three estates in France are? On the eve of the French Revolution, which are the three estates depicted in this cartoon? Or percentage-wise, anyone knows which percentage each group is holding? So you might get in a DBQ, let's say it's about the French Revolution, you might get a cartoon like that, and you might need to do analysis for this cartoon. So it's titled The Awakening of the Third Estate. So there's a low class was the highest percentage. That is correct. The lowest class is the highest percentage. Something like 95% of the population. Very good. So nobility, very good. So nobility is one of the classes. We have the lowest class, the third estate, and who's missing? Nobility. Clergy. Very good. So that's the three estates. You need to write them down. You need to know them for the exam, especially if you're going to get a DBQ about the French Revolution. So France is divided into three classes, or in the French term, estates. They're represented here. We got the third estate that kind of represents all the people. Very good, around 2%. So again, starting up the lowest class representing by called the third estate, that's probably 95% of France. That's basically people without any rights at all. Then we have in black, that's the clergy, that's the religious people, which are exempt from paying taxes, have a very privileged situation. And finally, the nobility. So we can assume the clergy and nobility might make 3 to 5% of the population, but the third estate basically makes the entire population of France. That's kind of France on the verge of the French Revolution in 1789, and this kind of like cartoon, the awakening of the third estate, like the third estate is coming into knowledge and conscientious, taking away his shackles, kind of breaking away and getting up, and you kind of see the other two estates are kind of like, panicking and basically running off from that situation. So that's a little bit background to the French Revolution. France, by the way, supported the American Revolution. So let's get the chronological order of these three revolutions. We have the English Revolution to start with. The English Revolution did not completely destroy everything. It was a stable revolution. It basically took away the power from the monarch, from an absolute monarch, and gave more power to the parliament. But it did not like alter life completely. You might do analysis on that if you get an essay. Then we're moving to the American Revolution. The American Revolution, a lot of it, if you studied, was financed by France. France sponsored and gave a lot of the money to the American Revolution. They gave weapons to the American Revolution. But one of the consequences of supporting the American Revolution was the fact that France went bankrupt. So the French Revolution basically starts up with the fact that it's a financial crisis. France needs money. And more than 150 years, most of the leaders in France being dictators never called the French version of a parliament, which the French version is called the Estate General. So for 150 years, the Estate General never met. So now, after 150 years of no meeting of the Estate General, the king, Louis XVI, is in trouble, and he needs to find a way to raise money. So in May 5th, 1789, he's calling a meeting of the state generals, and this is an opportunity for the 95% who are poor basically to come up and start asking for more. They're actually thinking about maybe they should pay less taxes, not more taxes, and they're very, very disappointed that this whole meeting is based upon just give us more money. And basically, after a few days, they get kicked out of the palace, and they meet in a famous tennis court outside, and they basically take what is known as the famous tennis court oath, saying that they're not going to leave until they're going to create a new constitution for France. So that's kind of the beginning of the French Revolution. Another famous event, of course, is what is known as the French Independence Day, July 14, 1789, when the mob basically attacks the Bastille, which is a garrison also functioning as a prison, and they release several prisoners, and they basically execute some of the guards. So it's kind of like a very violent day that is celebrated in French history. So American independence is July 4th, 1776. French independence is July 14, 1789, basically like 13 years later. And the French Revolution in the early stages is very, very influenced by the American Revolution. They kind of look at the success of the American Revolution. So that's an inspiration to the French Revolution. Another inspiration to the French Revolution is the whole idea of Enlightenment thinkers. Anyone can tell us some Enlightenment thinkers that influenced the French Revolution? In the exam also, you might need to know outside evidence. You're going to get 2 points for 2 pieces of outside evidence. So you're getting 5 documents. You're going to need to come up with 2 examples of outside evidence. So the more names you know, bigger chances. What do we got? John Locke. So John Locke is more maybe influential. Good point for the English Revolution. John Locke was a big supporter of the English Revolution. Who influenced the French Revolution? So John Locke is important maybe for the English Revolution or the American Revolution. I would plug John Locke for that. Voltaire, yes, Voltaire is a very good example for the French Revolution. So good example about John Locke, because I forgot about him. He's the person that came up with the whole idea of life, liberty, and property that influenced Thomas Jefferson to write about life, liberty, and anyone knows what Jefferson replaced property with? Life, liberty, and happiness. Pursuit of happiness. Very good. So you can kind of see John Locke influence in the English Revolution became a big influence on the American Revolution. So these two revolutions lead to the third revolution, the French Revolution. So more French philosophers such as Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, all of these Enlightenment figures were starting to talk about kind of like the ideals. But Rousseau, definitely Jean-Jacques Rousseau is probably the most influential. A lot of the people in the French Revolution constantly referred and talked about Rousseau as being a big influencer. So I definitely recommend to everyone to look up Rousseau, or join us on the 30th, April 30th, where I'm just going to do a stream about Enlightenment thinkers. That's going to be very, very helpful for the exam. So to get back to our topic, so the French Revolution can be divided into maybe two periods to make it easy. The first section, 1789 to 91, is kind of more of the liberal phase. They're trying to copy the version of the American Revolution. So they write a Declaration of the Rights of Man. So it's the first time defines a man as being free. In this document, we definitely see a lot of the influence of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that it states man is born, Rousseau wrote, man is born free, yet everywhere is in chain. And in the Declaration of the Rights of Man, they're writing that man is born free. So we can see that influence. They write a constitution in 1791. Now, the King of France is really, really bullied by this whole convention. He's not really interested in giving them any rights, but things are moving very, very quickly. So in 1791, mainly under the influence of his wife, he decides to flee France, what is known as the Flight of Varennes, and he actually gets captured and being brought back to France, and basically is putting in the house arrest. And to make things more radical for him, the leaders of Prussia and Austria are threatening France that if anything happens to the king, that there will be consequences for that. And because of that, France basically declares war on Austria, and later on, basically, France is going to go into a war with all of Europe. So for the first 2 years, France is acting in a liberal phase, trying to become like kind of like England, the United States, have a parliament, take away the rights of the king from being a dictator, and maybe sharing power. But when Louis tries to flee France, things are moving into a more radical phase. And somebody wrote on the side, I think, Marquis de Lafayette. So he's a great example to know. So definitely in the first stage, Marquis de Lafayette, who fought in the American Revolution as a general, came back to France, had a lot of credibility because he fought for the American Revolution. He kind of like heads the French army. So he's trying to do like an American version in France, but it's not really working. So in 1792, if you want a turning year, the French Revolution is moving from Marquis de Lafayette to a more radical phase with this guy over here. Anyone knows who this guy is on the right? Or who represents more of the radical phase in France? Another great piece of information for outside evidence. Who studied the French Revolution about the radical phase? Who's the most famous person in the radical phase in French? Robespierre. Very good. Golden points. So you guys are answering all the good questions tonight. So France is moving from this to this. And the context, of course, is the idea that France is going to be invaded that gets everyone really, really super paranoid. So the second stage of the French Revolution is kind of influenced by more radical people such as the Jacobins, which are kind of like the more radical phase of the more radical part of the French Parliament, and the sans-culottes were kind of like more the working class, or kind of like stirring up more violence. So in 1792, basically the legislative assembly basically is getting under the control of the Jacobins, the more radicals. So if you want, it moves from the liberal to the radicals, and radicals want more radical solutions. They don't want like kind of like constitutional monarchy, kind of like England or the United States with like a president who kind of acts like a king. They want the monarchy to be abolished, and they want France to become a republic. So it's a very, very radical stage. And the beginning of that is the September Massacre, when they hear that armies are marching into Paris from from Austria or Prussia, a lot of them are starting to think there are many people in jail that are going to fight on behalf of these people. So what do we need to do? Maybe we should start killing them. So before you know it, September Massacre, hundreds of prisoners, close to 1,000 plus, are being executed by mobs of people who are just afraid that they're going to fight on the opposite side. Another key part of the radicalization at the end of 1792, they're putting the King Louis XVI on trial, and eventually he's going to be found guilty and executed. So that's really, really going into how things are getting very, very radicalized. Also, throughout this stage, they're also issuing a national draft. So basically now the army is not just made of people of like, it's not led by the nobility anymore. Now it's based upon a meritocracy. Whoever is good is going to get promoted. And the army, to the surprise of many European nations, actually has a lot of success in battles because they're very, very connected to this new idea of nationalism, love for one's country. See if I have an image here for something from like that. Did I put anything on that? Okay, so nationalism, kind of like the French flag is adopted around what become the French flag later on, the French hat, the Marseillaise, which would basically become eventually the national anthem of France, is created during that time. The French motto of Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, which translates to liberty, equality, and fraternity, the French motto. So all of these symbols are created during that time, and we can definitely see that France is really, really connected to many of these ideals are embraced by the French people. So definitely the Jacobins are the more radical wing of France. They're taking over in the second phase, which is called the radical phase. And famous people from there you might want to know for the exam are people like Robespierre or Jean-Paul Marat. They're the one who are kind of pushing France into this more radical phase. And there are many, many other people that joined during that time. People like Thomas Paine, who's later famous for also was influenced to help the American Revolution during that time and writing important documents such as Common Sense. He also comes to France and joins these people. So we talked about the September Massacre. One of the inventions also of the French Revolution that kind of symbolizes the radical phase is, of course, the invention of the guillotine, which is kind of like, you might get complexity for explaining how the guillotine, on the one hand, is a mechanism of equality, but how it's also scientific. So interesting enough, historically, regular people used to be executed in very like gruesome way, like such as crucifixion. Yes, like Jesus style. Some people still got crucified and hanged. It was very, very horrible ways. Only nobility had the luxury of having their head cut off by a sword or by an axe. So during this time, they're actually inventing this new machine called the guillotine, which is kind of like more scientific due to the fact that it works all the time. It always chops ahead, and it's supposed to be kind of like more like less painful. Is it less painful? I mean, I don't know. Nobody came back and told us was it painful or not, but you can think about it for yourself. And it creates equality. Everyone is going to be executed in the same method. But during the French Revolution, this is called like kind of like the national razor. You have thousands of people who are constantly being executed in France. So the French Revolution really gets out of control. If the English Revolution or the American Revolution, if we do a compare and contrast, altogether were not that they removed one person and replaced them with another. They found stability afterward. In the French Revolution, things are just getting out of control and more people are being executed. Most famous, of course, it starts with the execution of the King of France, and it moves on to, we're assuming that more than 50, there's different numbers, but we're assuming more than 50,000 people got executed in around 10 months in a period that is called the radical stage, when the group that was called the Committee of Public Safety they kind of ran France as kind of like a military dictatorship. You don't have to know the names of all the people, and it's probably Robespierre over here is probably the most famous person because he was one of their most famous leaders that ran during this radical stage. Also, women in the revolution. You might get, if you get a DBQ, you might get a document mentioning women in the French Revolution. This is the first time we're seeing women starting to talk about their rights and demanding their equality. Women like Olympia de Gouges over here that writes a document, kind of like you have the rights of men, and she talks about the rights of women, kind of like a similar document, and adds women into it. We have Madame Roland as an example that basically is involved with the Jacobins, involved in the meeting and so forth. And finally, Charlotte Corday that wants to stop the radicalization of this revolution and wants to stop the mass executions and actually does something very, very courageous to stop the French Revolution. So women for the first time are standing up. Some historians wrote about it as the beginning of the feminist movement. I don't know personally if I would call it the beginning of that, but that's like different perspectives on that. Women are demanding more rights, not necessarily that they're getting it. It's not that during the French Revolution that they're getting more rights, but it's a beginning of women asserting themselves and trying to create clubs. When we reach the radical phase, a lot of the leaders are trying to suppress the rights of women. So it's not necessarily they got it, but they at least demanded that. That's a beginning of the stage of that. Marie Antoinette also was the wife of King Louis XVI, also got executed a year later in this radical stage. So the radical stage is talking about a lot of radical ideas. They want to eliminate religion completely. They want to create a bread of equality, no more white bread, for example. They want to eliminate streets with the name saint. So it's a lot of radical ideas that are being brought back this revolution during that time. But a lot of people are really, really getting tired of these mass execution. And one of the women I mentioned before, Charlotte Corday, decides that one way to stop this radicalization is basically to kill a person that constantly writes every day about mass execution. And that Jean-Paul Marat, who's one of the radical leader of this radical stage of the French Revolution, he constantly writes in his newspaper called The Friend of the People, constantly about that more people need to be killed. So she comes to his house, pretends that she has some valid information about the revolution, and she actually stabs him in his bath, and she believes that this will stop the radical phase. It doesn't really, but she's seen as a villain, but later on today in France, she's considered a hero. And one of the most famous painter of the time, if you watch one of my stream about neoclassicism, the most famous painter in French history, Jacques-Louis David, painted the death of Marat. Here is kind of like a Jesus figure, kind of like Pieta, and it's in the bottom here. It says Marat. His name appears over here like a grave. And this painting is pure propaganda. All of the information in this painting is completely inaccurate, from the fact that the letter that he's actually holding, which actually the letters that he held, it was the list of the people that he's going to kill. But the letter that they change here is actually showing him giving donations to orphans and widowers, which was not the case. There's a lot of misinformation in this painting, even though it's a very, very important painting and artistically a very skillful painting. So we talked about nationalism is very, very high in France. So to wrap things up, eventually the end of the Reign of Terror, after mass executions, even people inside of the radical wings of the Jacobins are saying we need to stop these mass executions. And even one of the original leaders named Danton is actually even himself gets executed. So it's kind of the revolution who eats his own children. Everyone is being executed. Everyone cannot be trusted, and everyone does not know how to find the end of the radicalization. It only comes to an end when Robespierre, the leader of the Jacobins himself, gets executed. He constantly every night goes to the convention and talks about more people that needs to be killed, and he gives names. One of the mistakes that he does, one of the last week of his life. He goes to the convention and says more people need to be executed, but he doesn't say any name. So everyone is thinking, I'm going to be executed. So they decide basically, why don't we just kill him and finish this thing? And that's how the end of the Reign of Terror finishes in 1794 with the killing of Robespierre. So that's basically it, what you need to know about the French Revolution. After the killing of Robespierre, there's 5 years of instability, and then Napoleon takes power over in 1799 and kind of says the revolution is over, but he also says, I am the revolution. So that's pretty much what you need to know. Quick summary of the French and the English Revolution. And again, remember, think Fiveable, follow Fiveable Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. There's also a link here to my Tai Chi and Qigong book if you want to do some exercise for relaxation, study a little about the history of Qigong Tai Chi. And let's get to Q&A if there's any questions. I know I gave a lot of information. Ask a question. So any question about the French Revolution, English Revolution comparison, this is the time. First question, let's see. Did they kill him out of fear? If you're referring to Robespierre, yes, most likely they killed him, because they didn't know who's the next person to be killed. So it's one thing if you say which people are going to be executed, and you're like, fine, it's not me. But if you give a general speech and saying many people here, might be, there's some traitors here, but you don't say which are the traitors, they're thinking I'm going to be next. So they definitely, if you're going for Robespierre, they probably fear them. That's a very good assessment to that. Any other questions? The English Revolution, French Revolution, the differences? Another question. Yes. Okay. Did the English Revolution have a radical phase? That's a good question. Okay. So compare and contrast. Yes, the English Revolution was more stable than the French Revolution and did not really have a radical phase. The French Revolution basically kind of was very long. Some people counted from 1789 to 1799, so it's like 10 years. But the French Revolution, they never really found stability afterwards. France had 5 different republics, so there's an ongoing thing. When is the revolution over? What's the achievement of the French Revolution? The English Revolution was very, very quick and very, very short. William and Mary just came over. They deposed the king beforehand, and the actual revolution is very, very short, and they're getting a new document, the Bill of Rights. The French Revolution was for 10 years, and it seems afterwards like they kind of restored the monarchy later on with Louis XVIII. So a lot of people are questioning, was the French Revolution successful? But that's a whole different question. What is the influence of the French Revolution, the English Revolution? That's something you might want to ask. Could we compare Louis XIV and Napoleon? I am France and I am the revolution. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like Napoleon is very, very interesting. You might want to watch my stream about Napoleon. You might get complexity from Napoleon. He's very, very interesting because the fact that he is saying Napoleon became successful due to the French Revolution that allowed somebody like him, who's kind of like lower nobility, wasn't even born in France, didn't even speak French. They allowed him to get promoted. So Napoleon, on the one hand, he's kind of like maybe I would call him an enlightened monarch, but they didn't put that in the key concept for the exam. But you can use that because on the one hand, he's a full-blown dictator, like Louis XIV, but on the other hand, he's invading other countries and bringing the ideals of the French Revolution. He's bringing ideas such as nationalism to all of these countries. All the countries that are being conquered by Napoleon, they see this French army coming in, singing the national anthem. They see the motivation of the soldiers to fight for their leaders. So yes, on the one hand, he's a dictator, but on the other hand, he's kind of like the French Revolution. So some people say revolution is over with Napoleon. Some people said, no, he actually exported the ideals of the French Revolution. So Napoleon and the revolution, that's a very interesting topic. I wouldn't say like it's very, very clear. I call him an absolute monarch. the College Board doesn't call him an absolute monarch. They put 3 other people as absolute, like an enlightened monarch. So he kind of like brings the ideals of the Enlightenment, but at the other hand, he's still some sort of a dictator, like Frederick the Great or Catherine the Great. He's very similar. Any other question? So they did it more to save themselves, and the end of the radical phase. Yes, probably they did it more to save themselves, or they probably understood that probably to save themselves more than caring about other people. I'll keep it simple. Yeah. So could you compare Napoleon? I'm the Revolution. I just answered that too. Okay. Any other questions? Now, again, when you get into all these angles, that might be the complexity point for the exam. But again, you have a challenge to do an essay for 45 minutes with 5 documents. So that kind of gives you 10 minutes to write. 10 minutes to read the documents. And then you end up having 35 minutes to write. So you're asked to do a lot of stuff. So all of these things about complexity, that's very, very hard to get into. I wouldn't try necessarily going for complexity. I would definitely try to go for outside information. The more information you know about the topic, 2 points, two pieces of evidence, if you can bring, that are not mentioned in the document, that these are going to be very, very easy points. If you know more names of people, know more events, that will help you for the exam. Any other questions? Okay, great. So thank you everyone for joining me tonight in this Fiveable review stream. And I'm going to be here next week, and we're going to talk about the Renaissance, Mannerism, and Baroque, talk about art in case we get some art documents in the DBQ, and it's going to be helpful to do some analysis. So thank you everyone for joining me tonight. Have a great evening. I'm hoping everyone is staying healthy. Peace out.